I had made Raphael Moretti's coffee 411 times before the morning a stranger's gift showed up on my desk and cracked open the careful little life I'd built inside his world. I know the number because I used to count things. It was a habit I'd picked up in my first month working the 39th floor. Back when I still flinched every time one of the men in dark suits walked past my desk without meeting my eyes. Counting kept my hands from shaking. 11 steps from the elevator to my chair. 2 sugars I never once put in his cup because he took it black. A single espresso pulled short in a chipped white mug that anyone else would have thrown out years ago. 6:40 in the morning, every morning 3 years running. That was me. Nora Callahan, chief of staff to a man half of Chicago pretended not to know, and the other half was too afraid to name out loud. The office took up the top 3 floors of a glass tower on Wacker Drive, all steel and cold light, and a view of the river that turned the color of gunmetal in winter. On paper, Moretti Holdings was an import and logistics company. We moved freight. We leased warehouse space along the Calumet. We had a legal department that sent very polite letters and a shipping schedule I maintained down to the hour. That was the version of the company I put in spreadsheets. There was another version, the one that lived behind the frosted glass door of Raphael's office. And I had learned very early that my job depended on knowing exactly where the line was and never once stepping over it. I was good at that, being useful without being curious. Present enough to run his life, invisible enough to be trusted with it. The morning it all came apart started like any other. I'd already reconciled the quarterly numbers, flagged 2 invoices that didn't sit right, and left the Halstead lease on the corner of his desk, with the problem clause underlined in pencil, because he hated highlighter. I was pulling up the day's calendar when Priya came around the partition with her coffee and a look on her face like she was about to hand me a lit match. "Okay," she said. "Don't freak out." Priya ran the front desk and knew everything that moved through those elevators. She was the only person on the floor I'd call a friend, and she had a gift for finding trouble the way a metal detector finds nickels. "That is not a sentence you open with," I said. She stepped aside, and there it was on the edge of my desks, a box. Not a gift bag, not a bouquet. An actual box, matte black, tied with a ribbon the deep red of dried wine, the kind of packaging that costs money before anything's even inside it. There was a small card tucked under the ribbon, cream stock, thick as a business card. "It came up with the 9 o'clock courier," Priya said low. "No company name, just your floor and your name." I didn't touch it right away. 3 years in that building teaches you not to reach for things you can't explain. But my name was on the card in handwriting, real ink, slightly slanted, and something about that made my chest go tight. Nobody wrote my name by hand. My mother, once a year, on a birthday card. The dentist on a reminder I always tossed. Not people, not strangers. I slid the card free. It said, "For the woman who notices everything and is noticed by no one." That's a waste I'd like to correct. No signature. Inside the box, nested in tissue, was a first edition of a novel I loved. A real one, the 1962 printing, the one with the green cloth boards and the misprint on page 40 that collectors chase. I'd mentioned wanting it exactly once, years ago, to no one who mattered, in a used bookstore in Andersonville while I killed time on a Sunday. I stood there holding $400 worth of book that somebody had bought, because they knew a thing about me. I'd never told a soul in that office, and the floor felt suddenly very far away. "Nora." Priya's voice had dropped all the way to a whisper. "Who is it from?" "I have no idea," I said, and I meant it, and that was the part that scared me. I should have said something to him right then. Instead, I put the book in my bottom drawer, and I told myself it was because I had a full day, which was true, and not because some stubborn part of me wanted one thing in that building that belonged to me alone. Raphael noticed anyway. Of course he did. The man could walk into a room and tell you which of the 12 people in it had lied that morning. He called me in a little after 11 for the Halstead lease, and I gave him the rundown on the clause, and he listened the way he always did, still as water, gray eyes fixed on some middle distance while his mind worked 3 moves ahead. When I finished, he didn't say anything about the lease. He said, "You seem distracted today." "I'm fine, Mr. Moretti." You reconciled the Q3 numbers and left 2 invoices flagged. He turned the pencil over in his fingers. "You do that when something's bothering you. You bury yourself in the work you can control." I hadn't known he'd noticed that about me. It rattled me more than I wanted it to. It's nothing. A personal thing. He looked at me then, really looked, and I watched him file the answer away somewhere, unconvinced. If it stops being nothing, he said, you'll tell me. It wasn't a question. It was the way he said most things. Like the world had already agreed with him, and I was just catching up. By 2 o'clock, he knew. I found out because Priya came back to my desk white as the tissue paper, and behind her, at the end of the hall, Cormac from security was standing outside Raphael's door, with his hands folded in front of him, like a man waiting for a funeral to start. Cormac was the one they sent when a thing needed handling quietly. 6'4" and about as talkative as a wall. Miss Callahan. He didn't come to my desk, I came to him, because that's how it worked. Mr. Moretti would like the item that arrived this morning, the box. His face didn't move. He asked me to collect it. I don't know what came over me. 3 years of doing exactly what I was told, and standing there in that hallway, I heard myself say, it has my name on it. If anyone's giving it back, it should be me. Something flickered behind Cormac's eyes, surprise maybe, or something closer to respect. Down the hall, the frosted door opened, and Raphael stepped out. I'd seen him angry. I'd seen him do the thing where he goes very quiet and very calm, and the temperature in the room drops 10 degrees, and grown men start finding reasons to be somewhere else. I had never seen it pointed anywhere near me. He crossed the floor with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and his tie loosened like he'd been pulling at it, and every head on that floor bent very carefully back toward a screen. Get rid of it, he said. Not to me. To Cormac. Have it destroyed. Not returned. Destroyed. It's a book, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. It's a book, and it's mine. He looked at me the way you look at a stranger who said your name in a crowd. You don't know who it's from. Neither do you. The words were out before the smarter part of me could stop them. Every person on that floor was pretending not to listen and hearing every word. You don't know who it's from, and you're standing here having a courier's package burned like it's a bomb, and I would very much like to know why a used novel has the most dangerous man in this city, looking like he wants to put his fist through a wall. I heard Priya's breath catch behind me. For a second, one long, awful second, nobody moved. Then Raphael turned to Cormac and said quietly, "Leave us," and Cormac left and the floor emptied around us the way water empties out of a cracked glass, and it was just the two of us standing in the cold light with the river gray behind him. "My office," he said. Inside, with the door shut, the whole building seemed to go quiet. He didn't sit. He stood by the window with his back to me, hands in his pockets, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to say anything at all. "The book was sent by Sebastian Vane," he said. I didn't know the name. I told him so. His father is Gideon Vane. They run freight out of the eastern seaboard up into Canada. Legitimate on the ledger. He said legitimate like it tasted bad. 3 years ago, Gideon and I were negotiating access to the same rail corridor. It ended badly. There are men who didn't come home from how badly it ended. He turned around, and the shadows under his eyes told me he'd known about this longer than I had. His son has been watching you, Nora. For about 7 months. The floor did that faraway thing again. He goes to the same coffee shop you do on Thursdays, Raphael said, and his voice was flat and terrible and precise. He was at that fundraiser you volunteered for in October. He's been to your gym twice, on the nights you take the late class. He knows you like that book because he was in the store the Sunday you held it and put it back. I gripped the edge of the chair in front of me. How do you know all of that? Because I've been watching him watch you, he said, since September. The room tilted. You've been following me. I've been keeping you alive. He crossed to me, and there was something raw in his face. I had never once seen in 3 years of black coffee and underlined clauses. Sebastian Vane doesn't send $400 books to women because he admires them. He does it because he wants something, and everything he's ever wanted has been a way to hurt his enemies. You started handling the Vane-adjacent shipping contracts 8 months ago. 8 months ago is when he started showing up wherever you were. You understand what I'm telling you? I did. It landed like cold water down my spine. You think he's using me to get inside your operation. I think he's been trying to. What I don't know, and here his voice dropped and I saw the effort it cost him, is whether he's already succeeded, whether you've said anything, given anything, whether he's turned you without you knowing it. That, I think, was the worst thing anyone had ever said to me. Worse than being followed. Being suspected by the one person whose trust I'd spent 3 years earning with every early morning and every silence I'd kept. I have never spoken to him, I said very quietly. I didn't know his name until 90 seconds ago. I have given him nothing, because I don't know he exists. And the fact that you can stand there and even ask me that. Nora, after 3 years, I had to ask. He said it low, almost gentle, and it stopped me. In my life, the people who get hurt are the ones nobody bothered to ask. I had to look at your face when you answered. I'm sorry. I don't think Rafael Moretti apologized more than twice a decade. It took the wind out of me. I sat down in the chair I'd been holding on to. Why do you care so much? I said. Not accusing, just tired and honest. About a book, about a man watching me. You have 100 people who work for you. If Sebastian Vane were following your accountant, you'd put a detail on him and move on with your day. You wouldn't stand in a lobby and have a courier package burned. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, he didn't look at me. No, he said, I wouldn't. And that was the whole answer. That was everything he wasn't going to say, said in 3 words, and both of us knew it. I should tell you what I'd spent 3 years pretending not to know. That when he handed me the mug back in the mornings, his fingers were careful of mine. That he'd learned I skipped lunch when I was stressed and started having something left on my desk, on the hard days, without a word about it. That the only time I'd ever seen him look afraid was the winter I'd slipped on the icy garage ramp, and he'd been out of the car and across the concrete before Cormac had even opened his door. I'd told myself it was the caution of a careful man protecting an asset. I'd told myself a lot of things. I stood up. My legs weren't entirely steady. I need to think, I said. I'm going to take the rest of the day. He didn't argue. He walked me to the door, and at the threshold he said, There'll be a car. Don't argue about the car. I didn't argue about the car. That night I sat in my apartment with the lights off and the first edition on my knee, and I thought about all the ways a smart woman was supposed to feel. Violated. Cornered. Used by 2 men. One who watched me from the shadows, and one who watched the one who watched me. There was a version of me who should have quit that job and moved to another city and never looked back. But I kept thinking about the way he'd said I had to look at your face. Like my innocence was the only thing that could put him back together. And I kept thinking about 7 months of a stranger learning me from a distance, versus 3 years of a man who knew I took my espresso the same as his and never once made me say it out loud. The next morning I went back, not because I was told to, because I'd made a decision, and I've never been able to stand at the edge of a thing and not walk into it. Raphael was in the private conference room, the one on the top floor with no windows and walls that ate sound. He'd called me up the second I badged in. There was a folder on the table, thick, and a laptop, and Tomas, his second, standing by the wall with his arms crossed and an expression I couldn't read. Vane reached out this morning, Raphael said. Through channels, he wants a meeting, neutral ground. A dinner, with you. He watched me take it. He's asking for you specifically, Nora. As a show of good faith, he says. He wants to discuss a business arrangement, and he'd like my chief of staff at the table. That's insane, Tomas said from the wall. It was the first thing he'd said. You're not seriously considering putting her across a table from Gideon Vane's kid. I'm not considering anything, Raphael said. She's not going. And here's the thing. 6 months earlier, I'd have let that be the end of it. But something had shifted in me in that dark apartment with the book on my knee, and I heard myself speak up in a room full of men who were used to deciding things without me. I think I should go, I said. Both of them looked at me. Hear me out. I put my hands flat on the table to stop them from moving. You said Vane is careful, calculated. He doesn't do anything without a reason. If he wants me at that dinner, it's because he thinks I'm the soft spot. He thinks I'm the way in. Which means for the length of one dinner, he's going to be looking at me and underestimating me. And that is the only time a man like that is ever stupid. I turned to Raphael. I've been reading your shipping ledgers for 3 years. I know what a clean manifest looks like, and I know what a lie looks like dressed up as one. Put me at that table, and I'll come back knowing more about what he wants than you'd learn from a month of watching him from a distance. The room was very quiet. It's not safe, Raphael said. You'll make it safe, I said. That's what you do. He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched the war behind his eyes, The man who wanted to lock me in the safest room in the city fighting. The man who'd just heard me lay out a smarter play than anyone else at the table. Finally, he said, "Lo, if anything about it feels wrong, you leave. You don't finish the entree. You don't be polite. You get up and you walk out, and Cormac will be 40 feet away the entire time. Okay, I mean it, Sparrow." It slipped out of him. He heard it a half-second after I did, and something in his jaw tightened like he wanted to take it back. He'd never called me anything but Nora, or Miss Callahan, on the days there were other people in the room. Sparrow, I don't know where it came from. Something about the watching, maybe. The small brown bird nobody ever looks at twice, the one that sees everything from the wire. I should have let it go. Instead, I said, "Sparrow? You sit at that desk," he said, quieter now, "and you watch every person who comes off that elevator, and you never miss one, and none of them ever know you're doing it." He looked at me like the admission was a stone he'd been carrying. "You've been the most watchful thing in this building for 3 years, and you thought you were invisible." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me, and it undid something I'd been holding shut for a very long time. I don't fully remember deciding to cross the room. I remember the folder sliding when I put my hand on the table, and I remember Tomas clearing his throat and finding somewhere else to be, and I remember standing close enough to Raphael to see that his hands weren't as steady as the rest of him. And then I kissed him, because 3 years is long enough to want something, and because I was tired of pretending I didn't. For a heartbeat, he went completely still, the way he did before he made a decision that changed the shape of a room. Then his hand came up to the side of my face, careful, like I was the first edition, like I'd tear, and he kissed me back with everything he'd been keeping behind that frosted glass door. When we broke apart, he pressed his forehead to mine and breathed out, and it wasn't steady either. "This is a terrible idea," he said. "I run your entire life. I know exactly how terrible your ideas usually are, and this isn't in the top 10. He laughed. I'd worked for the man for 3 years and I'd never heard him do it, not really, and it changed his whole face. "I'm not a good man, Nora," he said, and the humor drained out of it. "I've done things you'd have nightmares about. There are reasons I keep the door closed. You should want more than this. More than me." "I don't want what I'm supposed to want," I said. "I stopped doing that yesterday, in the dark, with a book on my lap. I want the man who noticed I skipped lunch." I stepped back enough to see his eyes. "But you don't get to follow me anymore. Not from the shadows. Not to keep me safe. If I'm in this, I'm in it with my eyes open, and you tell me the truth, and you stop deciding things about my life in rooms I'm not in. That's the deal. Those are the terms." I watched him weigh it. I think, if I'm honest, no one had put terms to Raphael Moretti in a very long time, and something in him needed it more than he'd have ever admitted. "Those are the terms," he said. The dinner was set for that Friday, at a steakhouse on the near north side, the kind with white tablecloths and a maitre, who knew not to seat certain parties near the windows. I spent 2 days getting ready, and not the way you'd think. I read. I went back through 8 months of the vein-adjacent contracts, every manifest, every route, every timestamp, and I built a picture in my head of what Sebastian Vane thought I knew and what I actually knew. And I made sure the gap between them was exactly where I wanted it. Here's what I figured out. Sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, with printouts spread everywhere. The information that had been leaking out of Moretti Holdings toward the veins hadn't come through me. I'd never touched it, but it had come through someone, because certain route changes had shown up on the vein side too fast, too clean. Within days of us making them internally, someone on our floor was feeding them. And when I lined up the dates of every leaked change against the access logs I quietly pulled Thursday afternoon, they all pointed at one person who'd had eyes on all of it. Not Cormac, not Priya, not Tomas. They pointed at a mid-level logistics coordinator named Reeve Dalton, who sat 2 rows behind me, who I'd trained myself, who brought me a coffee once a week and asked, always, so casually, what the boss had me working on lately. I didn't tell Raphael. Not yet. I wanted to be sure, and I wanted Sebastian Vane to hand me the last piece himself. And there's a cold, patient part of me that 3 years in that building had sharpened into something I didn't entirely recognize. So I went to dinner. Sebastian Vane was younger than I expected. Handsome in the way of men who'd never once been told no, with a smile that arrived a half-second before it reached his eyes. He stood when I came to the table, pulled out my chair, ordered a wine I was clearly supposed to be impressed by. Cormac was at the bar with a club soda he'd never drink, and I could feel the whole room the way you feel weather coming. "Miss Callahan," Sebastian said, "you're even more composed in person. Raphael doesn't deserve you." "You don't know what Raphael deserves," I said pleasantly. "You've spent 7 months in coffee shops. I've spent 3 years across the hall." His smile didn't move, but something behind it recalculated. "So he told you. About the book, about all of it." I wondered if he would. He turned his glass by the stem. "I'll be honest with you, because I think you'll respect honesty. I sent that book to see what he'd do, and he did exactly what I expected. He burned it. He panicked. A man who panics over a novel is a man with something soft he can't afford. You, Miss Callahan, are the softest thing Raphael Moretti owns." "I'm not something anyone owns," I said. "But go on." He leaned in. And over the next hour, thinking he was recruiting me, thinking I was the frightened, flattered, underestimated girl who'd fold at the first show of danger, Sebastian Vane told me almost everything. What his father wanted, which corridors, what the leaks had been worth to them. And when I steered him, gently, toward how they'd been getting their information so fast, he smiled that half-second smile and said, "We have a friend on your floor who appreciates being appreciated. Loyalty's cheaper than people think." He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. I already had it. But I had watched his face when he said your floor, and I'd caught the little flick of his eyes toward his phone, toward a text he'd sent before I arrived. And I understood that Reeve Dalton was somewhere in that building that very night, doing something he thought no one would ever trace. I set down my fork before the entree was finished, just like Raphael had told me to. "Thank you for dinner," I said, standing. "I don't think we'll be doing business." Sebastian's smile finally fully died. "You'll regret this." "People keep telling me what I'll regret," I said. "They're usually wrong." Cormac was at my elbow before I'd taken 3 steps. I called Raphael from the car. I told him everything, fast, in order the way he liked it. Reeve, the access logs, the dates lining up, what Sebastian had let slip about a friend on the floor, and the text he'd sent before I arrived. There was a silence on the line, and then Raphael said, in a voice I'd never want turned on me, "Server room, probably. If he's pulling files tonight, that's where he'd be. Stay in the car. Cormac stays with you." A pause. "Nora, you just did in 2 hours what I couldn't do in 8 months. You know that." "I read ledgers for a living," I said. "It's what I do." "It's not the only thing you do," he said, and hung up. I found out later how the rest of that night went, in pieces, over weeks. They caught Reeve Dalton at a workstation on the 38th floor, with a drive full of routing files and a burner phone with Sebastian Vane's number in it. He talked, the way scared men do, and what he gave them was enough to make the Vanes' whole operation suddenly very fragile, because a leak runs both directions once you know it's there. Raphael didn't do anything to Reeve that would make you close your eyes. He was smarter than that. He let Reeve keep working, for a while, feeding the Vanes exactly the information Raphael wanted them to have, and by the time Gideon Vane realized his window into Moretti Holdings had become a mirror, he'd committed men and money and a shipment to a corridor that turned out to be a very expensive dead end. I know because I built the false manifests myself. Raphael asked me to. He said no one else could make a lie look that much like the truth. I took it as the compliment it was. 2 weeks after the dinner, Gideon Vane asked for terms. They met on neutral ground again, and this time I wasn't at the table, which I'd made my peace with, because some rooms you send the man into alone. Raphael came home late that night to my apartment, which had somehow become the place he came, and he stood in my doorway with his tie already gone and his shoulders finally down for the first time in months. "It's done," he said. "Tell me." The Vanes pull back east of the lakes. They relocate their base of operations up to Halifax. Sebastian doesn't set foot in this city again. He came in, and I closed the door behind him. In exchange, I give Gideon back 2 corridors I took from him 3 years ago. And I don't press the advantage I've got from Dalton. He gets to walk away with his business intact and his son alive. He gets an exit with his name still on it. "You let him win a little," I said. "I let him retreat with something left to lose." A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in the world. A man who gets to keep his family and his name will spend the rest of his life protecting them instead of coming after you. He sat down heavily on the edge of my couch and looked up at me. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let your enemy leave the table standing. I sat down next to him. And Sebastian? Sebastian goes to Halifax and learns to be a legitimate businessman, or he learns what happens when his father can't protect him anymore. Either way, he's your problem never again. He took my hand. Careful of it, the way he'd been careful of it for 3 years, before either of us said a word about it. "I'm sorry I followed you," he said. "You were right. I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of not knowing you were safe, and that's not a good enough reason to take someone's life out of their own hands. It won't happen again. If I'm ever afraid for you, I'll tell you, and you'll decide what to do about it, and I'll live with your decision." Those were the terms. Those were the terms, I said. We didn't get married in a hurry, and I'm glad. I'd spent 3 years being told when things would happen, and I wanted this one to happen the way I chose. But 8 months later, on a Sunday, he took me back to that used bookstore in Andersonville, the one where a stranger had once learned a thing about me from across the room, and he'd bought the store's entire poetry section a week in advance and had them slip a ring into the spine of a beat-up copy of a book I loved, so that I'd find it myself in my own hands, no one deciding anything for me, just a thing on a shelf, waiting for a woman who noticed everything to notice it. I said yes, standing between the stacks with the ring in one hand and the book in the other, and Raphael Moretti, the most dangerous man in Chicago, laughed that laugh I'd only heard him do a handful of times, and the girl behind the counter had no idea who he was, which was, I think, exactly how he wanted it. We got married in the spring, small, in a garden south of the city, 30 people who'd earned their way into that circle. Priya cried through the whole thing and then organized the seating chart because she couldn't help herself. Cormac wore a suit that wasn't for work and smiled once, briefly, and I'll treasure that till I die. Tomas gave a toast that started as a warning and ended as a blessing. I still count things sometimes, old habit, but the numbers are different now, not steps to the elevator or how many mornings I've survived. I count the years, and there are more of them stacking up than I ever thought I'd get. I count the ordinary things. The coffees, still black, still in that chipped white mug he won't let me replace, except now I make 2. People who know a little about my husband and nothing about my marriage like to tell me what I am. A soft thing a dangerous man keeps. A woman who got in over her head. Somebody who was used once by a stranger with a book and rescued by a boss who watched too closely. They're wrong about the last part most of all. I wasn't rescued. I read the ledgers. I sat across from the man who thought I was the way in, and I walked out with the thing that took his whole operation apart. I set the terms I chose at every turn, with my eyes open, knowing exactly what I was choosing and exactly what he was. That's the part they never put in the story. Not that a dangerous man loved me, that I looked at all of it, the shadows and the blood and the closed door, and I decided, on my own, that I wanted the man on the other side of it anyway. Not because it was safe, because it was true. He calls me Sparrow to this day. I never did tell him it stuck the first time he said it, up in that windowless room, back when I was still pretending I hadn't already made up my mind. Some things you keep for yourself. I learned that at a desk on the 39th floor, watching everyone, being watched by no one, counting the mornings until the one that finally changed everything.